Now tell me, Karen, again the time here. We're going to stop it in an hour?
We're in an hour,
Okay.
right.
Good.
Good morning. My name is Karen Keppel, a member of Westminster's Social Justice team. The Social Justice Forums are built around a common theme, and this program year, the theme is Building Solidarity Together, walking alongside all God's people, striving for a more just world, acting courageously to transform social systems and relationships. This morning, we are pleased to welcome Harry Boyte, Senior Emeritus Senior Scholar in Public Work Philosophy at Augsburg University, founder and former director of the Center for Democracy and Citizenship at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and a staff member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, headed by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. With his work, Harry has seen firsthand the dynamic, open, inclusive citizenship of the men and women involved in the civil rights movement. He will discuss the idea of the Commonwealth and our role as citizens in revitalizing the Commonwealth. His topic this morning is the return of the citizen. Real timely, given our upcoming election. First, a couple of logistical items. For those attending in person in the Meisel room, raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone to you. This is real important, so all the people on the live stream have an opportunity to hear the question as well as Harry's answer.
Thank you so much.
And for those attending the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your question and or comment. As a part of our ongoing effort to promote respectful conversations around concerns in our community, the social justice team has established guidelines for for meaningful conversations and respectful conversations. And I want to call out the fifth bullet point, if I can get to that. We've chosen this year to focus on one in particular for each of our weeks, and this week we're focusing on, we would ask you all to read all of them in terms of our conversation here this morning, but for this morning our focus is honoring the image of God. We'll avoid stereotypes and generalities, especially those related to specific racial and ethnic members of our community. And so with that, we'd like to have Harry begin, but let's start with a prayer. Let us pray. Holy One, God of justice, breathe into us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of voices from our community. Guide our speech and our self-awareness so we may honor the divine in all people. Amen.
Amen.
So now please welcome Harry.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Jackie DeFries, I think, who suggested I come to this. I'm glad to see democracy and the state of democracy is a topic at Westminster this month, appropriately. Bob Bauer spoke recently on democracy in crisis at the Town Hall Forum, and Larry Jacobs, for many years a colleague at the Humphrey Institute, now school, is soon to give an address called Democracy Under Fire. The Westminster is a splendid forum for this kind of discussion. Today, I talk about democracy and the role of the citizen from another vantage. I raise the topic from an international perspective, not simply an American perspective. It's a topic and a crisis all around the world. And I raise it from the point of view not of the institutions which are called democracy, like elections and governmental agencies, which are part of it, but I raise the topic from the perspective of citizens, everyday people, and the great democracy movements which have shaped and enlivened and fleshed out democracy over many, many years. So I'm talking especially from the point of view of the civil rights or freedom movement in the United States, and also the movement for democracy in South Africa, which my wife was intimately involved with from the time she was a teenager. We work now together. Last Friday at the University of Illinois' YMCA, we talked about this same topic from the perspective of what does it mean to talk about democracy as a way of life, not simply a set of institutions like elections. We talked at a wonderful forum. The Y at the U is the oldest Y in a college anywhere in the country, 151 years old. And they have a forum that is 97 years old, every Friday, called the Friday Forum. And we were honored to speak there. For 20 years, Murray Strum, my wife also, as well as my partner in democracy work, directed the democracy education program of really arguably the largest and most influential democracy group in Africa. It began as the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. And they saw firsthand from the bottom up, from the perspective of the struggle against apartheid and then for democracy, what democracy meant. They played a key role in the peaceful transition, a role that's often not noted because institutions like political parties want to claim credit. But actually it was a people's movement that ended apartheid with significant leadership from others. But the Institute for Democracy in South Africa played a key role in 1986. The leader of the parliamentary opposition to apartheid in the government, a guy named Frederick Ziel van Slabbert, quit Parliament to the shock of the nation. And he said, we're headed towards a racial war, a conflict, bitterly divided between a kind of hunkered down white establishment and the black majority, more and more violent. Government and parliament and politics are not going to solve this problem. Politics is normally thought about as electoral politics. So he quit, created the Institute for, then called a Democratic Alternative, and undertook what they called a politics of engagement, or a citizen-centered politics, which involves everybody, not simply politicians. And they broke the impasse between black and white by organizing a high-level meeting in Senegal, out of the country, between the exiled leaders of the African National Congress, the liberation group, and people in South Africa, including many leaders in religion, in government, in unions and business and academia, who were deeply worried about the future of the country and thought we cannot continue on the path we're on. We're really headed for a war. And this meeting between the ANC and leaders in South Africa really broke the impasse. It got enormous attention. They couldn't put the South Africans who went to the meeting in jail because they were too prominent. They were too well known. They were too significant figures. But it was a breakthrough, and then Adasa built on that a series of hundreds of meetings over the next 7 years between blacks and whites at every level of the society, from local communities to church groups, to youth groups, to women's groups, journalists, that really created relationships for the first time across the widening racial divide. So I think it's on the topic of the Justice Forum. And they also were very involved, probably the leading group, in preparing for the election all across the country, involving thousands and thousands of people in preparing for the famous election in 1994, which broke apartheid, ended it, and elected Nelson Mandela as the first black president. And then they were very involved in the enormous consultation across the country and with people around the world on the Constitution. So Adasa and their partners and thousands of people in South Africa and millions around the world celebrated the world historic election that ended apartheid, and they celebrated the Constitution, which had a pioneering Bill of Rights, including protection of the rights of gay people for the first time in any constitution in the world. And they even had a meeting right after the election saying, well, is our work over? And they began to realize, no. And it became more and more clear as the years went on. The Constitution itself, in addition to this outstanding Bill of Human Rights, has on virtually every other page a description of mechanisms, legal mechanisms for citizen participation. The language was we're going to create a participatory democracy, and this was at a local government, it was police, schools, every level of government. There were participatory mechanisms. So Adasa came to realize, and this realization deepened over the years, that the election was only the beginning. And also that government and government officials and participatory governmental mechanisms by themselves don't produce democracy. You can't produce strong democracy without strong citizens. And so Mari's unit, her democracy unit, which I had been very involved in the education up to the election, shifted its focus to mainly focused on creating, developing, cultivating strong citizens and civic institutions. And they had many accomplishments over the years, and they also came up to enormous opposition, including for the political leadership. They did grassroots leadership development. They called citizen leadership development, empowerment projects, training and organizing skills in townships and shack dweller settlements, and then also among professionals, journalists and health workers and others. And again, of course, the ANC would come in and try to shut it down. Who were you? What gave you right to talk about solving problems and being public actors? That's a tension that I want to name at the beginning. So I think the lesson of South Africa, which is an international lesson, is also the same lesson as America. We can't count on political leaders of however good intent to create democracy for us. It is all of our work. We need a democracy 3.0 around the world. So this is a global speech that looks at democracy as a way of life built upon empowered citizens and civic institutions in which government is a partner, not the solution, and not the center of the action. Now that's a different frame, right? To develop that today, I'm going to ask not only what to do about the crisis of democracy, but a prior question: what is democracy? And I want to do that with the aid of three ideas that comes out, in my experience, comes out of the freedom movement, the civil rights movement, but also can be found around the world, including South Africa and, I would say, democracy movements across the globe. These are the three ideas. Aspirational citizenship, not legalistic citizenship. Free spaces, settings where people become strong citizens. And a story about democracy. Aspirational citizenship. So the political theorist, Melvin Rogers, black political theorist at Brown, a great student of the black intellectual tradition, did really the first major canon of black thought called African American political thought 2 years ago, and this last year wrote a book called The Darkened light of faith, which talks about how could black people and intellectuals in large numbers continue to believe in democracy even though they had faced a terrible legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation. He develops a concept of aspirational citizenship. Now, aspirational citizenship is not citizenship as defined by the Constitution. It's dynamic, it's open, it's plural, it's ever developing, it's a work in progress. In the civil rights movement that I was involved in the Young Men, as I'll describe, it was really the understanding of citizenship. So when people invoke citizenship today, we're not talking about the same thing. You have to take account of the world as it is and how citizenship is legally defined, but citizenship is far deeper and broader and more dynamic. The great poet of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, got at this in his poem, "Let America be America again." Now, he didn't mean that America had ever been a democracy or an inclusive democracy for him. But he meant it's an aspirational democracy. And Vincent Harding, who was a little-known figure, but enormously important in the civil rights movement, very close friend of Martin Luther King, a theologian, a philosopher, historian, who would always talk about the movement as a chapter in the deepening of democracy for America, turned Hughes' poem into a statement of what citizenship is. He said, Langston Hughes he said, "America has never been America to me, but America must be." And in a speech to the Children's Defense Fund in 2012, Vincent Harding said, "I am a citizen of a nation which does not yet exist, but must be." And so this was young people with this Children's Defense Fund. He got them all to sign a pledge. They will dedicate themselves to a nation that must be inclusive, generous, kind, full of justice. I really encountered that understanding on a large scale in 1963 at the March on Washington. My dad had been manager of the Atlanta Red Cross and then become involved in school desegregation, left the Red Cross, got involved at sometimes great cost. He was almost killed in school desegregation efforts in North Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. And then Martin Luther King asked him to come on staff in 1963. And I was hitchhiking around the country wondering if I was going to be a seafaring poet or go to college. And I called home and Dad said, "We're going to have this march to get the attention of the nation. The movement feels stymied in terms of the agenda of desegregation of public facilities and other goals. And you should come. Find somebody to drive you back." And so drove day and night, got to Washington, put my sleeping bag on my father's hotel floor. He'd just gone on staff as a special assistant to King. The only white person on the executive committee, I should note. And I heard Dr. King's booming voice in the room next door in the Willard Hotel practicing "I Have a Dream." I have a dream. That was a moment of transformation and impact. But the next day during the march, I thought the speech was inspiring. I was equally inspired by the marchers. Truck drivers, auto workers, students, teachers, sharecroppers, men and women, people of all races, much more interracial than people remember today. And the march program notes Karen, I should send them to you, and this would be good to post. The program notes really convey the march and its spirit as well as, if not better than, Martin Luther King's great speech. The program notes put it, the march is a living petition of scores of thousands of citizens of all races. It will be orderly, but not subservient. Proud, but not arrogant. Nonviolent, but not timid. By the way, that's an understanding of nonviolence which needs to be interrogated and looked at a possible topic for the justice group. Now, this is key. The marchers also showed the difference in their living demeanor. I mean, it just blew my mind as a young 18-year-old between a mob and a public, and also between a group of clamoring consumers or customers and a public. The political theorist Margaret Canavan describes political sobriety in this way as an exceptional degree of political realism and common sense, together with a remarkable capacity to exercise self-restraint and put shared long-term interests over short-term impulses. Now, do you think we need that today? We need publics, not mobs or clamoring customers. And the march notes described it. They say, in a neighborhood dispute, there may be stunts, rough words, and hot insults, but when a whole people speaks to the government, the quality of the action and the dialogue needs to reflect the worth of the people and the responsibility of the government. That was a call to political sobriety and aspirational citizenship. I should just note other aspects of the march contributed to the impact. So this is important, again, something we talk to young people about all the time. Bayard Rustin. How many people have heard of Bayard Rustin? So if you haven't, by all means, see the Netflix movie called Rustin.
Oh, yes, I have. Okay, I'm sorry. I should raise my hand.
So Barack Obama, Obama's production company, sponsored it. Said it's the point of the march of the movie is to show that the march was not only individual leaders, but it was people of all walks of life, showing America at its best. And the sobriety and the quality of the march was also framed by Rustin, the organizer, the best organizer in the movement. He mentored King about nonviolence. Philip Randolph sent him down in the Montgomery bus boycott to talk about how to think about this politically. He was kept out of sight and not well known because he was gay. But the way he framed the march is really important to remember and discuss. He told everyone, all the staff, all the hundreds of volunteers, that the country has 1/3 supporters of the civil rights movement. 1/3, maybe 20, 25% really dyed-in-the-wool opponents. So most Americans were somewhere in the middle. They had vague sympathy. They didn't like the police dogs unleashed on children in Birmingham. But they weren't strong supporters. They didn't even see it as in their interest. It was somebody else's struggle. So the march is meant to make the point that this is our struggle. And if you think about Martin Luther King, he brilliantly did that. He tied the march and its goals to the struggle of Americans to create a better democracy. Rustin was also keenly aware that this was a people's march, and that was different than a government march or a politician's march. So he had to fight, like everything, to get the march leadership not to accept Kennedy administration's offer for Kennedy to speak at the march. They had a sense that after opposing the march, it's going to happen, and not only this, it could be a big event, and Kennedy should be there so he could get credit. Rustin succeeded in scotching that idea. It remained the People's March. So the second, that's basically an illustration, a living illustration of aspirational citizenship. The second concept is free spaces. Sarah Evans, a women's historian and my former wife, developed the concept of free spaces out of our own experience in the civil rights movement. They were the places, including an occasional church, and certainly the student union, the Methodist Student Union at Duke University, and but also barbershops and beauty parlors and places where people, diverse people, a public could mingle and become more of a public. And that was a conscious strategy for the civil rights movement, as I'll describe in a minute. But free spaces are where people of diverse backgrounds learn to interact in public. And they learn to develop relationships and respect and appreciation for people who are different. They also learn that they can be agents of change. They develop skills and confidence and hope. So a little-known story of the movement is that the free spaces of the movement were not only black churches, which of course were very, very important, and other black organizations. Black communities in the depth of Jim Crow facing a world of white supremacy and brutality and lynching and violence, black communities across the South created 5,300 schools and 10,000 libraries called Rosenwald Schools and Libraries. This is another thing to put up some material on. It's really an amazing story of democracy building and aspirational citizenship and advance of democracy in the midst of the most arduous circumstance. So Rosenwald schools were named for a fund at Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington, who was the president, had teamed up with a businessman, Julius Rosenwald, who headed Sears Roebuck, kind of the Bezos of the early 20th century. Some of you may remember the catalogs. He was a great marketer, but he's also a philanthropist. And he also had a particular philosophy of philanthropy that's different than a lot of the government program approach. People really only appreciate something if they help to make it. And the way the fund was set up, and Washington had a lot to do with this. Washington his democratic subversive dimensions are not really well appreciated, even in academia. He didn't make much noise about segregation, but he did have a vision through Tuskegee of black empowerment on community levels across the South. That was his real vision. Anyway, they set up the fund so that communities could apply to the fund for 1/5 to 1/3 the cost of building a school. They had to find the rest of the resources, and they had to figure out how to keep it going. But that catalyst, that fund, sparked this enormous program of building, black communities building schools and libraries across the South. And they were, because people built them, they felt they owned them. And they felt this was the community center. And so they put all sorts of sweat equity, labor, and supported the schools through fish fries and other ways. And there was a network of black teachers, women teachers, called Jean's Teachers, who often organized the communities to build the schools. They were the supervising teachers. They had gone to historically black colleges and universities. They knew the democratic philosophies of people like Howard Thurman and Benjamin Mays. And they were very wise about pedagogy. They believed in the point of education should be education for democracy. That was their language. And they put that into practice by really an extraordinarily creative pedagogy that involved the whole community as teachers, that involved drawing on the students, young people's backgrounds, their families, their cultures, their parents' work, their traditions, and that taught nonviolence and taught citizenship. And the schools were centers of community life and pride. They were also centers of power and confidence building and citizen leadership development. So the story is amazing. Rosenwald schools trained the leadership of the civil rights movement. John Lewis, Coretta Scott King, Medgar Evers, the journalist Eugene Robinson, who's still going and the associate editor of the Washington Post. When the black community in Little Rock succeeded in getting Eisenhower to support sending troops to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, guess who they got to be the students? The 9 students all had gone to Rosenwald schools. And that was not an accident. I mean, those students had confidence and they had poise. And then Jim Lawson helped them learn nonviolence, which was also an extraordinary resource. Another story. There's a great video of Lawson describing how he did that with the Little Rock 9. When we started what became the Center for Democracy and Citizenship at the invitation of Harlan Cleveland, the dean at Humphrey, I invited to help us out Dorothy Cotton, who was head of the Citizenship Education Program of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We had a network of 900 citizenship schools across the South, which basically built on the Rosenwald schools. There's a fine study by a black student at Yale named Ali, who looked at the Rosenwald schools and their impact, and she had resources to study them all across the South and their correspondence to their literature. And she found that they fed directly into the citizenship schools, which I worked for as a field staff of the movement. But Dorothy described their purpose as, first of all, spreading a different understanding of democracy as a way of life everywhere. Everywhere. Democracy should be spread, the culture, the values, egalitarian, inclusive, dignified, citizen-centered everywhere. And she also put it this way. In the citizenship schools, we intended to establish and deepen the concept and awareness of ourselves and others as citizens. I would always say, you will discover your capacity and your obligation to help solve the problems we face in communities as well as a people, as a society. And this is the key realization. If things are going to change, you have to realize you are going to be the agents of change. So Dorothy taught many generations of Humphrey students the song that she used to sing, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." Now, free spaces haven't disappeared. Democracy depends on free spaces in many places. One story I used to tell at the Humphrey Institute was a Humphrey drugstore. His father in Dolan, South Dakota, created, in a town where he was one of 5 Democrats in a town of 600 Republicans, he created his drugstore as a free space. He didn't call it that, but it was a civic center. It was a center for discussion and debate and life. And Humphrey's father was elected mayor of the town. Humphrey himself said he learned everything he knew about politics from his father's drugstore, sitting behind the counter as a young boy. But today, well, I would say that Westminster has certain elements of free spaces. It's a place where people discuss and debate and think about things and develop. Just a couple of other examples. Well, and Minnesota has been full of them. Our Center for Democracy and Citizenship was commissioned by the Congressional National Conference of Citizenship to look at the state's civic culture. And to our pleasure, we found Minnesota, according to many measures, voting levels, volunteering, philanthropy, even having meals together, participating in neighborhoods, is the most civically engaged state in the country. And when we looked at the reason, it was clear that that was because there were many, many, many different kinds of free space. Settlements like Phyllis Wheatley settlement in the north side of Minneapolis, black churches, cooperatives, the farmer labor program, education program in the 1930s and 40s, neighborhood gatherings, libraries, the women's club movement. I could go on and on. But Minnesota was rich with a legacy of free spaces, and they still continue. Just to mention a couple, some of you may have heard of the group Braver Angels, designed by a colleague, longtime colleague with our center, Bill Doherty at the University of Minnesota, family therapist, who took his family therapy approach to the problem of polarization. Minnesota for many years for several years, was formed in 2016 after the election to address the problem of polarization. Minnesota had more members than anywhere else. I think it still has a very, very large number. We've become involved through our church, an Episcopal Church, St. Matthew's. It was aimed at developing methods for people to overcome what's called affective polarization, which means you don't disagree with people, you hate them. If they have a different point of view, they're wrong, they're evil, they're bad. So Braver Angels methods are really effective in helping people get beyond those stereotypes and reductionism and diminishment of the person. Just another point, another example is what's called Third Way Civics, coordinated by a colleague at the Minnesota Humanities Center. So it's a rapidly spreading movement of college student courses to teach civics in a depolarizing way. Now, how do they do that? Trigg would be somebody to invite, or some of his colleagues. There are a number of colleges in Minnesota that use it now. It can be adapted for a lot of other things, too. But the basic method is really simple. It believes students can make sense of the world on their own. So it involves students reading primary sources that have many points of view on the great controversies of American history, from the Revolution to slavery to civil rights to women's suffrage and so forth. And students make sense of it themselves. The professor does not tell them what to think. And the evaluations show all sorts of student capacities are developed through that process. That confidence, belief in themselves, belief in their fellows, trust in others, more civic involvement. So it's a really important free space. And it's designed explicitly as a free space for students. But we have a problem. We started at Humphrey in 1987 with the understanding of democracy as citizen-centered that I had learned from the movement, and also with a diagnosis of a problem. It was clear that free spaces were disappearing. The Humphrey drugstores were turning into CVS's or Walgreens. And that was true not only for drugstores, but it was true for churches, for schools, for all sorts of nonprofits, becoming more service delivery operations and places for people together. So we started addressing that, and we've done that for more than 30 years. That's another story. But one thing we realized was we're fighting an enormous obstacle, which is the marketization of the society, which is also spread by a kind of expert culture. But all sorts of free spaces turned into service operations as the people who managed them and led them, the professionals, saw themselves and learned in their usually college experience to see themselves as experts of a particular field delivering services to citizens who were described as customers and clients. So the power dynamic shifted. It became acting on lay citizens rather than with citizens. Bill Doherty's life changed when he learned to think of himself as a citizen therapist who needed to learn to work with people and catalyze people's energies. And the problem is, that has become the dominant model in government. Customer service has taken hold. It's officially enshrined in a philosophy of governance called New Public Management or Reinventing Government, in which citizens are defined as customers. And that's become more and more entrenched. And you can see this in the shift in language from the earlier elections in the 20th century to this last election, this election. So George Bush, if you remember back in his election, said his campaign was about a rebirth of citizenship. He made that his point in his inaugural address. I ask you to be a citizen. Barack Obama built his whole campaign around the idea of citizenship, a rebirth of citizenship. And he said, and this is an honest statement, the problems we face as a society are far too big and complex for government to solve. We need all hands on deck. It's very strong statements. But this year, if you pay attention, citizenship is a forgotten word. Neither Republicans or Democrats talk about it. For all the enthusiasm at the Democratic Convention, not a single person mentioned citizenship. And ironically, and it drove me crazy, because, well, the Obama campaign asked me to put together a civic engagement policy committee, which I was the co-chair of. So we had a lot of ways the government could act in a different fashion as a catalyst, not a service provider. The partner with citizens, not somebody who tried to tell citizens what they should do. So I'd lived the 2008 campaign, but it was especially disturbing that the President Obama changed his slogan when he talked about Kamala Harris to say, we need to remember the slogan of my campaign, yes, she can. Remember that? And we need to prove that government is positive, that democracy can deliver. Democracy is something that delivers the goods is different than democracy is us. And the data shows what the result of this is. I mean, it was even Obama's economic advisor, Larry Summers from Harvard, who said, nobody is going to care about something that just delivers them goods. Nobody washes their rented car. And the country has become more and more a nation of clamorous customers asking for things. There was I'll send you this too, Karen. There's a very good piece by a city manager who describes what happens, what this looks like. He calls it government as vending machine. You put your votes in and your taxes in and you get stuff out. Well, that's actually the language of the new public management. It's all over government. But the problem is you lose citizenship and you lose a sense of democracy as us. So the third point is we need another story of democracy rather than customer service and service delivery. And that's true here, and it's true in South Africa, and it's true around the world. The polls show an enormous drop in trust and confidence towards government at every level. And even drop in confidence towards local institutions like schools and congregations as they become more customer service operations. But a new story is possible. So let me just tell you a final vignette, and this is about stories. I would say politicians can't make democracy, and politicians can't do democracy for us. But at moments, political leaders, if they're visionary and if they have a sense of the people as the driver of change, can help develop a story that's different. That was true for Abraham Lincoln, a new birth of freedom at Gettysburg. It was true for Franklin Roosevelt when he took office and said, government can't fix the problems of facing the nation in the Great Depression. We're going to call on the work of the whole citizenry to address them. And there is a similar story in recent times. It's just not widely talked about. So in 1992, I worked a little bit with the Clinton campaign, and we pushed hard to have Clinton, who's, for all of his complications, he has a feel for people's mood and sensibility and potential, to push, to say, when I'm president, I can't fix a country's problems. And he gave 2 speeches on that, and then when he took office, we created a coalition, this is out of the Humphrey Institute, called Reinventing Citizenship, to work with the Domestic Policy Council to look at how government could shift from simply a service provision model to a collaborative partnership model and a catalytic model. And that's a story that's told in several books, including Benjamin Barber's The Truth of Power. It's also told in a book by Carmen Siriani called Civic Innovation in America, detailed stories of that. But the significant thing is this. After the election, which was a disaster for the Democrats in 1994, some of you may remember, Bill Galston, who we were working with, who was the chief domestic policy advisor, got Clinton to hold a Camp David meeting on the future of democracy. He said, something's happening in the country. We need to rethink what our message is, what our approach is. So the administration brought together several public intellectuals engaged in intellectuals, that is Scott Spoll and Ben Barber and Shelby Steele. It was a kind of a cross-partisan mix. Bob Putnam and me. And we told about, and we had found many examples of government working as partner, not service provider, in education, in housing and human development. In fact, the Secretary of HUD, Henry Cisneros, was a big champion of this whole shift in paradigm. And it was for the Clinton State of the Union, and we talked about how this would reach people in a different way if you talked about government as a partner, not simply doing things for people. So Clinton built his State of the Union speech on January 24th, 1995, around what he called the New Covenant, shifting from government as service provider to government as partner. And this is how he put it. We must not ask government to do what we could do for ourselves. We should rely on government as a partner to help us do more for ourselves. And he gave the example of FEMA, which they were changing to be a partner, not a saving people. And he said, most of us in politics haven't helped very much. We've treated citizens as if they were consumers and spectators, and we know how to make you hate each other. He said that in his State of the Union. Look at the address. And finally, he says, if you go back to the beginning of the country, the great strength of America, as de Tocqueville pointed out long ago, has been our ability to work with people who are different, to find common ground. In this day, we need to do that much more. Well, the next day, I talked to E.J. Dionne at the Washington Post, and about the reaction, he said, we've been polling people all night. The voters are kind of puzzled because it's not the way politicians talk. And he said it's not going to continue because both Republicans and Democrats in Washington think Clinton has lost his mind. And then E.J. told me something very wise. He said, this message is not going to take hold until there's a citizen groundswell that asks for it. It's going to be the people who carry that message. And I took that as a charge. And our work ever since has been around how do you stimulate citizen initiatives which are significant. The National Civic League has just come out with a map called the Ecology of Democracy, which is worth linking to, which shows 10,000 local groups are working on improving and building democracy from a different frame than the customer service frame. So there is ferment. What there's not is a story. And we have to find ways to make that into a different story of America. So I just want to end with Walt Whitman, who understood something of this in 1892, the poet. Well, I know what he says. We have often printed the word democracy, yet I cannot too often repeat it is a word the real gist of which still sleeps. unawakened. It is a great word whose history remains to be written. And I would say that we, the people, have to write that story, and it is our challenge to take up that charge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harry, for your wisdom and such an interesting collection of long history. It strikes me that we think this is a problem of today only, that we've cornered this whole thing, and not so. But I want to open it up to questions from within the audience and online.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very inspirational. Very inspirational. I had this view of the March on Washington and then January 6, 2021, and the difference of nonviolence and violence coming to the Capitol, how extraordinary that was. But one thing that jumped out at me, and I met the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964 at Stanford. And I was 13 years old. One thing that jumped out at me was that the March on Washington didn't have any women speakers, and that was very intentional. 1963, women were left behind the door, the redheaded stepchild. And today, you look around to this room, it's a majority of women, and I can say a majority of women of a certain age, too. We also understand aspirational democracy. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think it's a very good point. It wasn't that there wasn't a big fight about no women speakers. People like Ella Baker and all sorts of people pointed it out. And of course, there was a very big fight about having Rustin speak. He was the organizer of the march, and he was gay. But, you know, there were many women leaders in the movement, and especially of the grassroots organizing citizenship wing of the movement. So the citizenship schools of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, 900 schools which had come out of the Rosenwald schools, which themselves had been organized by a network of black women teachers called the Jeans Teachers, another story that's really important. You know, the citizenship schools that SCLC was led by people like Dorothy Cotton and Septima Clark and Ella Baker, who really had a feel for people's development. So there were tensions about this. And I think my former wife, Sarah Evans, has written a good deal about this, her personal politics and her history of American women. Talk about the role of women in creating foundations of a democratic New Deal, for example, through the Women's Club movement and the League of Women Voters and all of those organizations in the early 20th century. So this is a long history. I would say that women leaders can be caught by the same customer service trap, and are. I think we need people of all backgrounds and genders and orientations to become catalysts. So the model of professional we use, or leader we use, is a catalyst who gives up the notion of control and works with people rather than on people. And at certain moments, even politicians do that, and that was Clinton's speech. But thanks for the question, a great question.
We have about 1 minute left. We have about 1 minute left. Do we have another question?
So I'll try to answer briefly.
I was wondering if you could just address briefly, you know, the protest movement on college campuses this last year and the way that administrations have responded to it. I've been so disappointed in, you know, the kind of crackdown on that attempt to affect change and have that discourse. And I was really moved by an op-ed in the New York Times by the Wesleyan president, and he really talked about, like, we should want this. We should want our students to be so engaged that they are, protesting and asking us for these, asking to have this discourse. And so, and that, and I just wonder how that fits into what you're talking about building citizenship.
Well, it does, exactly. And again, I think often college presidents, like politicians, aren't necessarily the leaders of building democracy. They tend to work out of their incentive structures and their constraints. But I also think that the protests, and I should note that the Braver Angels group has now 60 chapters of students who are not avoiding conflict, but talking about it in a way that doesn't demonize their opponents. And I think the tragedy of the local movement is that, of the movement around Gaza and the war and now the water war, is that students have had very little experience with nonviolence. That you don't demonize, you don't turn your opponents into them, evil people who are, caricatures of who they really are, who have their own stories. One of the key foundations of citizenship is understanding, as nonviolence puts it in the second principle, which Eugene's teachers practiced. Everyone has a story.